Elias's life was a series of silent repetitions, a cycle of grays and muted tones unfolding in the indifferent vastness of a major city. For all practical purposes, he was a well-dressed ghost, a blur at the edge of everyone else's vision. His existence boiled down to occupying space without leaving a trace, breathing the same air as others but without sharing their vitality. That day, like so many others, Elias's invisibility reached an almost palpable peak. He was standing in line at the bakery, the aroma of fresh bread and coffee hanging in the air like an unfulfilled promise. When his turn came, the attendant, a young woman with fiery red hair and distracted eyes, simply looked right through him. Not with malice, but with the absolute lack of recognition reserved for inanimate objects. "Next," she sang out, her voice loud and clear, directed at the man behind Elias, a hurried executive talking on his cell phone. Elias felt the air thin in his lungs. It wasn't the first time, nor would it be the last, but the precision of that oversight hit him with the force of a punch. He tried to speak, but his throat felt coated in sand. The executive, without even noticing the interruption, lightly nudged Elias aside, as if stepping around a lamppost. He left the bakery without the bread, without the coffee, and with the cold certainty that there was something fundamentally wrong with his frequency in the universe. He wasn't ugly, nor was he particularly handsome. He wasn't tall, nor short. Elias was the personification of the middle ground, the epitome of visual mediocrity. His features were so neutral they seemed designed to be forgotten. He walked down the sidewalk, and the city seemed to conspire to reinforce his condition. Couples laughed, children ran, and traffic flowed, but Elias was an island of silence in the middle of the whirlwind. He watched a woman stumble and instinctively reached out to steady her. She recovered on her own, and her gaze, as she stood up, passed through Elias like a ray of light through clean glass. She thanked the air, or perhaps fate, and moved on. "I am a social miscalculation," he muttered to himself, his voice rough. Invisibility wasn't just the absence of glances. It was the absence of interaction, of impact, of resonance. At work, his ideas were invariably repeated by a more outgoing colleague 5 minutes later, and the credit went to the second person. At social gatherings, he could stand in the center of a circle of conversation, and no one would address him unless they needed to pass by. He arrived at his apartment, a cubicle on the 10th floor of an old building, and the loneliness embraced him with the familiarity of an old coat. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the coffee stain he had left there the morning before. The stain, he thought with bitter humor, had more presence than he did. That night, Elias didn't sleep. He drowned in a retrospective of his life, searching for the exact moment the color had drained away. There was no single trauma, just a slow, progressive erosion of his own will to be seen. He had grown accustomed to being the observer, the extra, and the world had gratefully accepted his role. Elias's invisibility wasn't a sudden event, but the result of a lifetime of small surrenders. Since childhood, he had been the quiet son, the average student, the friend who listened more than he spoke. His home, a functional apartment in the Santa Cecilia neighborhood, was a reflection of his soul. Clean, organized, but devoid of any trace of passion or creative disorder. The walls were white, the furniture light wood, and the only vibrant color came from a ceramic vase he had inherited from his grandmother, but which remained empty. His job as a data analyst at a large logistics corporation was the perfect refuge for his condition. Elias dealt with numbers, with the cold logic of supply chains and route optimization. The data didn't judge him, didn't ignore him. It simply existed, and he manipulated it with almost surgical precision. He was good at what he did, perhaps excellent, but his excellence was silent, absorbed by the bureaucratic machine. The coffee stain on the kitchen table, which he observed that sleepless night, was more than just residue. It was a symbol of his inertia. He had left the stain there, knowing he should clean it, but the strength for that small act of maintenance seemed to have vanished. The stain was a small rebellion against order, but even that rebellion was passive. He got up and walked to the window. The city of Sao Paulo below was a sea of lights that pulsed with an energy he didn't feel. He thought of his downstairs neighbor, Mrs. Lucia, an elderly woman who grew orchids on her balcony and who occasionally offered him a hurried, "Good morning." Even Mrs. Lucia, with her predictable routine of watering flowers and watching soap operas, seemed more connected to the fabric of life than he was. Elias tried to remember the last time he had truly laughed, a laugh that came from deep in his diaphragm and not just a social reflex. The memory was hazy. Maybe in college, at a bar with friends who were now just names on a contact list. He had isolated himself gradually, not by conscious choice, but by a slow slide to the margin. Invisibility, he realized, was an autoimmune disease. His own system had decided he was a foreign body and had isolated him. The next morning brought a harsh, unforgiving light. Elias dragged himself to the bathroom and stared at his reflection. And there, in that mirror, he saw the naked truth. He wasn't invisible to the world. He was invisible to himself. The man in the mirror had slumped shoulders, empty eyes, and an expression of resignation that seemed carved in stone. His clothes, though clean, were an indistinct gray, chosen to blend into the city's concrete. He was a mime of absence. The epiphany came not as a lightning bolt, but as a cold, logical whisper. If he didn't see himself, how could he expect others to see him? Invisibility was an armor he had forged to protect himself from rejection, but which was now suffocating him. Enough, he said, and the word echoed in the small bathroom with an authority he hadn't felt in years. The change began almost imperceptibly. Elias didn't set out to be the center of attention, but simply to be present. The first step was the hardest: the wardrobe. He threw out the gray shirts and beige sweaters. At a department store, he bought an electric blue shirt, almost offensively bright, and a pair of leather shoes that made a distinct sound when he walked. The act of putting on the blue felt like a physical challenge. He felt naked, exposed to the world's judgment. The decision to change, uttered in that "enough" in the bathroom, wasn't a battle cry, but a sigh of exhaustion. Elias was tired of being the extra in his own life. The act of buying the electric blue shirt was an almost transcendental experience. In the store, he felt observed, and cold sweat ran down his back. The saleswoman, a young woman with tattoos on her arms, approached him with a professional smile. "Can I help you?" Elias pointed to the shirt, a blue that seemed to have stolen the color of the summer sky. "That one," he said, and his voice cracked. "Great choice," she replied, without irony. "It's the color of confidence." The word, confidence, resonated with Elias. He didn't know what that was. He bought the shirt and a pair of brown leather shoes, with soles that promised a dry, decisive sound with every step. The next day, leaving the house, he felt the weight of the shirt. It was as if he were wearing neon armor. In the elevator, his neighbor, Mrs. Lucia, stared at him. "Nice blue," she said, and her smile was genuine. "It suits your skin tone." Elias didn't stammer. He smiled back. "Thank you, Mrs. Lucia. Are the orchids inspiring you?" Mrs. Lucia laughed, a rough, warm sound. "Maybe. Color is important, my young man. It reminds us that we are alive." That small dialogue was an earthquake. Elias had been seen, and he had seen back. He had broken the cycle of indifference, the office. The blue shirt caused a small stir. Not a stir of admiration, but of strangeness. People noticed. And noticing was the first step toward visibility. Elias's transformation wasn't limited to the surface. He realized that his voice was as inaudible as his appearance. He spoke softly, hesitantly, always expecting to be interrupted or ignored. He enrolled in a public speaking course, a place full of people who, like him, struggled to find their voice. The teacher, a robust woman named Clara, with a voice that could crack concrete, allowed no excuses. "Your voice is a muscle, Elias," she said, her eyes fixed on his. "If you don't use it, it atrophies. It's not about what you say, it's about the intention behind the sound." Elias began to practice. In the shower, on the way to work, he recited poems and speeches. He trained his breathing, projection, and modulation. The sound of his own voice, once a strange murmur, began to become familiar. An instrument he could control. Clara's public speaking course was held in a dusty auditorium downtown. The room was a microcosm of silenced souls: a lawyer who stammered in front of the jury, a teacher who feared speaking to students' parents, and Elias, the man who couldn't be heard. Clara, the teacher, was a force of nature. She didn't teach stage techniques. She taught the ownership of one's voice. "Your voice is your sonic fingerprint," she boomed, pounding her fist on the table. "If you don't use it, you don't exist. The world won't lean in to hear your whisper. You have to stand up and speak." Elias's first exercise was to read a poem by Fernando Pessoa. He read it in an inaudible murmur. Clara interrupted him. Again. "Elias. And this time, imagine the person you love most is on the other side of this room, and you have to tell them you love them before they leave forever." Elias closed his eyes. He didn't have such a person, but he imagined himself, the Elias of 10 years ago, full of unfulfilled dreams. He opened his mouth, and the voice came out rough, but with an intensity that surprised everyone. "I am the size of what I see, not the size of my height," he read, and the phrase, spoken with conviction, felt like a manifesto. Each week, Elias gained an inch of voice. He learned to project the sound from his diaphragm, to use pauses as punctuation marks of power. He discovered that the hesitation wasn't in his tongue, but in his mind. The first opportunity came during a team meeting. The boss asked for suggestions on a new project. Elias felt the old urge to shrink, to let the idea die in his mind. But he remembered Clara, the intention, took a deep breath. And when he spoke, his voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. He presented his idea, and for the first time, no one interrupted him. The colleague who usually stole his ideas blinked, surprised. "That's an excellent suggestion, Elias," the boss said, making a note. That moment was more significant than the compliment. It was the validation of his presence. He had broken the spell. Elias's new visibility brought with it a new set of challenges. He began to attract the attention of people who had previously ignored him, and not all attention was positive. There was a colleague, Ricardo, who had always been the center of attention, the owner of the room. Ricardo was the type of person who fed on the invisibility of others. He noticed the change in Elias and didn't like it. Ricardo began making sarcastic comments, trying to diminish Elias's contributions. On one occasion, he tried to repeat Elias's idea as usual, but Elias interrupted him, not with anger, but with a calm assertiveness. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, Ricardo," Elias said, maintaining eye contact. "But this is my suggestion, and I'd like to develop it." The room fell silent. Ricardo backed down, momentarily disarmed. Elias had confronted the shadow of his former life, and it had dissipated. Elias's promotion to lead the route optimization project was a turning point. He was no longer the anonymous data analyst. He was Elias of the South Project. Ricardo, the colleague, intensified his campaign of subtle sabotage. He spread rumors, questioned Elias's methodology in public, and tried to undermine his authority. Elias's shadow was no longer invisibility, but envy. One afternoon, Elias called him for a private conversation. They sat in an empty meeting room, the tension hanging in the air. "Ricardo," Elias began, "I know what you're doing, and I understand." Ricardo tried to defend himself, but Elias interrupted him with a calm gesture. "You're used to being the only light in the room, and now you see mine," Elias continued, his voice steady. "But I'm not trying to put out your light. I'm just turning on my own. I know you're good at what you do. Let's focus on the work, not the competition." Elias's honesty disarmed Ricardo. He was a bully who only knew how to fight against weakness. Confronted with vulnerability and strength, he backed down. I've always been the guy," Ricardo mumbled, his voice low. "And you still are," Elias replied. "But your light doesn't need to extinguish mine to shine. There's room for both of us." From that day on, the relationship between them changed. They didn't become friends, but the hostility turned into cautious respect. Elias had learned that visibility wasn't just about being seen, but about recognizing the humanity in others, even in those who tried to diminish him. The true depth of the change, however, came in an unexpected encounter. In a park, he saw the bakery attendant, the one with the fiery red hair. She was sitting on a bench, crying silently. Elias hesitated. The old Elias would have walked straight past, fearing the intrusion. The new Elias felt a pang of empathy. He approached and sat down at a respectful distance. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft, but present. She looked up, her eyes red. She stared at him for a moment, and then, for the first time, she saw him. I don't know," she replied, her voice choked. "It's just life." They talked for almost an hour. Her name was Sophia. She was overwhelmed with work, college, and the pressure of being her family's provider. She confessed that she often looked at people without truly seeing them, lost in her own fog of worries. "I'm so sorry," she said suddenly, "but I feel like I've seen you before. You're a customer at the bakery, aren't you?" Elias smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I was the man who wasn't seen," he said. "But I'm working on it." Sophia laughed, and the sound was like the ringing of bells. In that moment, Elias realized that visibility wasn't a spotlight, but a connection. He didn't need to be the center of the universe. He needed to be a point of light in someone else's universe. The encounter with Sophia, the bakery attendant, in the park, was the peak of his emotional journey. She was sitting under a flowering ipe tree, the yellow petals falling around her like silent confetti. When Elias approached, he saw the pain in her eyes. He didn't see her as the attendant who ignored him, but as an overwhelmed soul. "I'm Elias," he said, sitting down. "I'm the guy you never saw at the bakery." Sophia smiled sadly. "I'm sorry about that. I'm Sophia. And I feel like I'm becoming invisible too." They shared their stories. Sophia talked about the pressure of supporting her family, the dream of being a fashion designer, and the fear that life would just be a series of shifts at the bakery. Elias talked about the coffee stain, the blue shirt, about Clara and the voice. He didn't give advice. He gave testimony. "Invisibility is a choice, Sophia," he said, repeating the epiphany. "It's not the world that ignores us. It's us who allow ourselves to be ignored. You have to stand up and say, 'I am here.'" Sophia looked at him, and the gratitude in her eyes was a balm. She didn't need a savior, but a mirror. Elias's journey didn't end with the discovery of his voice or Sophia's smile. The transformation was a continuous process, a tapestry he wove every day. He started dedicating himself to a hobby he had abandoned: photography. Before, he photographed empty landscapes, reflections of his own solitude. Now, he photographed people. He captured the fleeting beauty of a smile, the melancholy of a gaze, the intensity of an embrace. His photos were full of life, of presence. He set up a small exhibition in a local gallery. On opening day, the room was full. Sophia was there, radiant. Clara, his public speaking teacher, nodded in approval. Even Ricardo showed up, with an expression of reluctant respect. Elias was in the center of the room, but he didn't feel overwhelmed. He was anchored. Photography became Elias's language. He had abandoned the lens for years, fearing his photos would be as empty as his life. Now, he saw the world with a brutal and compassionate clarity. He didn't photograph landscapes, but the intersection of life. The tired smile of a street vendor, the wrinkled hand of an elderly person holding a newspaper, the ephemeral joy of children playing in a fountain. His first exhibition, titled The Geometry of Presence, was a modest but significant success. The photos were in black and white, but the intensity of the captured gazes was more colorful than any palette. The art critic, Mr. Valerio, was a man of few words and a fearsome reputation. He spent hours in the gallery, examining each photo with the precision of a goldsmith. When he approached Elias, the silence in the room was almost deafening. "You have the vision, Elias," Mr. Valerio said, his voice rough. "You don't photograph what is beautiful. You photograph what is real. And the real is always harder to see." He pointed to a photo of Sophia, taken in the park, with the yellow petals falling around her. She was laughing, and the sunlight captured the hope in her eyes. "This," the critic said, "is your masterpiece. It's proof that the light isn't in the object, but in the artist's gaze." Elias smiled. He had found his purpose. Elias's life didn't become a fairy tale. He still had to deal with work bureaucracy, occasional loneliness, and Mrs. Lucia complaining about street noise. But now, he dealt with it as an active participant, not a passive observer. He and Sophia became friends. She had enrolled in a night design course, and occasionally, he photographed her for her portfolio. Ricardo, in turn, had become a reluctant ally at work, and they formed a surprisingly effective duo. Elias realized that presence wasn't a state of being, but a continuous act of choice. It was choosing to speak, choosing to see, choosing to feel. It was the courage to occupy his space in the world, even if that space was just a small point of light in the vast tapestry of existence. He was Elias, and he was seen. And the world, he discovered, was much more interesting when he was willing to be a part of it. The success of Elias's exhibition opened doors he never imagined. Mr. Valerio, the critic, not only praised his work but invited him to participate in a photographic documentation project about life in major cities. It was a job that required travel, constant interaction, and, above all, the ability to see the soul of the cities. Elias accepted. The idea of leaving the security of his cubicle and launching himself into the world was terrifying, but the prospect of continuing the journey of self-discovery was irresistible. Before leaving, he had one last meeting with Sophia. She had been accepted into a scholarship program for fashion design in Milan. Her eyes, once full of weariness, now shone with the promise of a future she had earned. They met in the park, under the flowering ipe tree. "You taught me to stand up and say, 'I am here,'" she said, holding his hand. "And now, I'm going to say that to the world." Elias smiled. "And you taught me that connection is true visibility. I wouldn't be going if I hadn't met you." There were no promises of romantic love, but a deeper promise, that of friendship and mutual support. They were souls who met at a turning point, and the connection between them was proof that invisibility had been banished. On the day of his departure, Elias was at the airport, wearing a leather jacket he had bought, which somehow seemed perfectly suited. He was no longer disguised in grey. He looked back at the city that had ignored him and now celebrated him. He felt no resentment, only gratitude. Invisibility had been the cocoon that forced him to transform. His last act before boarding was to send a message to Ricardo, his colleague. "The route optimization project is in your hands. I know you'll do a great job. And remember, the light is yours." Sitting on the plane, Elias looked out the window. He was no longer the man who wasn't seen. He was the man who chose to see. And in doing so, he had become finally visible. Life was no longer a series of silent repetitions, but a symphony of encounters, colors, and sounds. He had found peace in accepting his own presence and happiness in the ability to connect with the world.